Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Education Week webinar, ESSA Explained, Inside the Nation's New K-12 Law. I'm Mark Baumster, and I'm an Assistant Managing Editor for Education Week. Today's webinar has been sponsored by Instructure. We're excited to spend some time with you today digging into the details of the Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA. It replaces the No Child Left Behind Act and overhauls the main federal K-12 law for the first time in more than a decade. The final rules are still being hammered out, but in general, ESSA is going to put more control and responsibility in the hands of state and district educators when it goes into full effect in the 2017-18 school year. Here to talk more about what's in this sweeping new law and what it means for educators on the ground is Andrew Ujifusa, an assistant editor at Education Week and our lead congressional reporter. He's been tracking ESSA all along, and he'll walk us through the state of play as this new law rolls out. Let's explain, before we get started, some technical housekeeping matters for today's presentation. Please check the audio setting on your computer and your speaker volume settings in case you're having any audio trouble. If you're still having issues, please see our detailed audio troubleshooting file. It's available in the handouts folder at the bottom of the console. There are also some other icons on the webinar console that open additional feature panels. You can read about today's speaker in the bio panel. You can click on handouts to download a copy of today's slides and follow the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter using the hashtag EWWebinar. To submit a question for today's speaker to answer during the Q&A session, type it into the Ask a Question box located just above the chat window. Finally, an on-demand archive of today's presentation will be available within the next 24 hours online. Both the archive and a free-to-download version of the PowerPoint slides will be accessible through edweek.org. With that, I'd like to hand over the presentation to Andrew Ujifusa of Education Week. Andrew, take it away.
All right, thanks for that introduction, Mark. As Mark indicated, the Every Student Succeeds Act contains many changes for education policy at the federal, state, and local levels. It's important to keep in mind that while many of the big shifts in ESSA are relatively clear-cut when you see them on paper, school leaders of various stripes are still figuring out what all of this means in practice. As Mark indicated, ESSA is the latest version of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was first signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson in 1965, and it replaces the No Child Left Behind Act. Congress was actually several years overdue in reauthorizing federal ed law before it passed ESSA, which President Barack Obama signed last December. For several years prior to that, the Obama administration had granted states waivers from portions of No Child Left Behind in exchange for adopting certain policies. And states are still figuring out what the transition from not just NCLB, but NCLB waivers means in the context of ESSA. So there's one other point I want to include here for context. You've probably heard that ESSA returns more control over certain policy matters to states as well as districts. And right now, Republicans have a pretty significant advantage in terms of the number of state legislatures and governorships they control. To use an example of GOP dominance at the state level right now, there are 6 states where Republicans control the legislature, the governor's office, and the state superintendent's post. What are the number of states where Democrats exercise that level of control? 0. So expect that dynamic to be an important factor when folks start examining the broader impact of ESSA. And just something about the timeline. The Every Student Succeeds Act goes into full effect for the 2017-18 school year. So the upcoming academic year is sort of a transition time for states as well as districts. We don't yet know exactly the deadline for states to submit their accountability plans for ESSA, but expect states' preparations for ESSA to begin picking up later this year and into next year. So the next presidential administration, in fact, will have at least some impact, if not a lot of impact, on the beginning of the ESSA rollout. So I just want to give a quick rundown of key things that ESSA is leaving behind, so to speak. There's no more federally required adequate yearly progress, or AYP, that much reviled rising target for student test scores through which all students were supposed to be proficient by a certain date. And also NCLB waivers, which I mentioned earlier, which many states sought in order to escape that AYP requirement, those waivers expire August 1st, 2016, although states still have to account for low-performing schools even after that date. And a few other signature Obama-era programs like Race to the Top are gone. I'll have more on that as we go along. So let's first discuss accountability, where the federal government arguably exercises the most control over K-12 policy. Unlike with AYP, states can set their own academic goals under ESSA, but they must address test scores, English language proficiency, and graduation rates in those goals. And they must also somehow address gaps in achievement and graduation between certain groups of students. For elementary and middle schools, the accountability systems must contain 3 academic indicators: proficiency on state tests, English language proficiency, and an academic factor that can be broken out by all of the traditional NCLB-era style subgroups, like growth on state exams. And here's a big shift in ESSA. There has to be at least one other indicator of so-called school quality, like student engagement, access to advanced courses, school climate, or another measure. That opens up a lot of possibilities for states and districts as they rethink how and how broadly to judge schools, but it also opens up a lot of challenges. How will states disaggregate a lot of the data about school climate, for example? And could they be concerned about disparities between groups of students that the data might reveal? And will using indicators like student engagement for accountability simply be a bad idea? Some people think so. It's important to note, however, that the academic indicators have to count, quote unquote, much more, according to ESSA, than that indicator of school quality. Just what that looks like for different weights for the various measures, we don't know yet. And just a note on high schools, the accountability sort of setup, it's pretty much the same, except accountability for them also has to incorporate graduation rates in some fashion. So right now, many states in sort of the pre-ESSA world are not showing much of an appetite for having a large and diverse number of indicators in their accountability systems. That's according to a new Center for American Progress report. And a 2014 analysis conducted by a former colleague of mine, Michelle McNeil, found that many states were not taking advantage of the flexibility that waivers offered when it came to accountability and including different measures. So right now, for example, although it's something of a hot topic, school climate is used by only 4 states right now in their accountability system, according to that Center for American Progress report. What will probably be the biggest changes for states? First, many more states are going to have to start including English language proficiency in accountability. Only 6 do so right now. And also, states are going to have a lot more work to do to disaggregate all of their data for all of their subgroups. That's an ESSA requirement. Let's stop for just a second. So you might be asking, what's a subgroup? Think of each subgroup as representing an individual demographic of students. So African American students at a school constitute a subgroup. So do special education students and students who qualify for free and reduced price meals, and so on. ESSA maintains the focus on student subgroups, and it's a big priority for civil rights advocates. They don't want some students to be ignored by schools and districts, regardless of overall school or district performance. Under ESSA, many states will have to stop using their so-called super subgroups, which combine several subgroups of students, like those from low-income backgrounds and those performing poorly, into a single large group for accountability purposes. As you might guess, these super subgroups were unpopular with those same civil rights advocates I mentioned earlier. It will be interesting to see how and how well states transition away from those super subgroups. Now let's touch on school turnarounds. Yes, indeed, states and districts will still be required to identify and address struggling schools under ESSA, although what that looks like exactly is changing. States must identify the bottom 5% of schools when it comes to student achievement under ESSA. They also have to take action in high schools, where the graduation rate is 2/3 or less. And both states and districts have to identify schools where subgroups of students are struggling academically. For the bottom 5% of schools and those with low graduation rates, districts must work with teachers and other school staff to create turnaround plans. States will monitor the results. If these plans don't lead to improvement after at most 4 years, States must step in, and then they can implement their own turnaround strategies, such as firing the principal or taking over the school, or allowing students at these chronically low-performing schools to transfer to other schools of their choice. So along with the Race to the Top competitive grants, the School Improvement Grant Program for school turnarounds, that's eliminated under ESSA. Both of those things are. However, it's important to note that states, if they choose to, can set up to 7% of their federal Title I dollars aside for school improvement purposes. That's up from 4% under previous federal law. So maybe you've heard that testing is a controversial issue. So how does ESSA deal with it? First, you should know that the law does not do away with the core requirement of NCLB that students be annually tested in grades 3 through 8 and once in high school in reading and math. That was actually a tricky point of negotiation for federal lawmakers, but ultimately those tests stayed in the law. But here's something new under ESSA. States have to disaggregate the test scores not just for the traditional NCLB-era subgroups, but also for homeless kids, kids in foster care, and kids connected to the U.S. military. ESSA also keeps the requirement that schools give science tests in certain grade spans. So many of you are perhaps wondering how the law does and does not address testing opt-outs. What's the answer to this in ESSA? The law requires states to test at least 95% of their students. However, ESSA permits states to have their own laws allowing parents to opt their children out of those exams. So what does that mean for testing opt-outs going forward? The end result is unclear. However, that's not to say that there aren't other important, more clear changes to testing in ESSA. In high schools, for example, districts will be able to administer a nationally recognized test as long as the state gives them the green light. That means districts could pick the SAT, ACT, PARCC, Smarter Balance, and potentially others, instead of giving their high school students a traditional state exam. And students taking advanced math courses above their grade level under ESSA can take a correspondingly advanced exam instead of their grade level exams, provided that certain students get accommodations on those tests. Now, as for teacher evaluations, remember how states that wanted NCLB waivers, for example, had to agree to evaluate their teachers using student achievement measures? Say goodbye to that, because ESSA gives the federal government absolutely no role in determining how states evaluate their teachers. That's probably in part because of the vigorous, sometimes nasty debate over evaluations triggered by various federal and state officials. So will states drop these test score-based evaluations like a hot potato? We don't know for sure. So far, there have been at least a few states that have indicated that they want to stop doing such evaluations or at least change how they work, but it might take a few years before we can discern any broader trend in terms of how teacher evaluations change under ESSA. Oh, and speaking of often ugly policy debates, under ESSA, the U.S. Department of Education is barred from using any carrots, sticks, or any other objects, for that matter, to try to get states to adopt any particular set of content standards. Does that remind you of anything? That's right. Washington won't be able to do what it did with the Common Core state standards. ESSA does not force states to adopt the Common Core or require the Common Core. ESSA does, however, require states to have, quote, challenging academic standards, but doesn't define that term. The NCLB required essentially the same thing. One thing I want to stress about many of the policies in ESSA that I've just mentioned, both the Obama administration and state legislatures have been relatively proactive in changing many aspects of K-12 education in recent years. Some of those changes have engendered backlash, and ESSA tightened the reins on some things the federal government can do with respect to education in response to what the Obama Education Department did. But a key question for many people will be, are the recent policy changes supported by Obama and others durable, particularly at the state level? Or will they fade away or warp into something else now that there's less federal pressure or activity in certain areas, as will likely be the case under ESSA? So let's get back to specifics. One aspect of ESSA that many folks might have overlooked is its new transparency and data requirements. I mentioned English language proficiency earlier as a key issue that ESSA is emphasizing in a new way. Under the law, states and districts will now have to report how many of their English language learners are still struggling to reach proficiency after 5 years. Think of these folks as long-term English learners. And state report cards on schools will also have to include per-pupil expenditures at both the district and individual school level, I should say. Some are hopeful that this new transparency around school expenditures will start new conversations about what constitutes both equitable and adequate funding, both within districts and between them. However, just because there's more information out there, it won't automatically and smoothly lead to actions and reactions. In fact, that increased transparency has contributed to at least one significant fight in Washington over school funding rules under ESSA. I'll have more on that in a little bit. Post-secondary enrollment figures, where available, also have to be published by states because of ESSA. And in most states, in fact, those figures are available. States will have to tell the public how many students from each subgroup of students a school must have in order for them to be included for accountability ratings at that school. And for you researchers out there, here's some good news. ESSA requires that data be presented in a way that will make it easier for you to do your work, because that data now has to be cross-tabulated. So, with all of those new transparency requirements now on the books thanks to ESSA, the big question is, as I alluded to earlier, it's one thing to have information put out there, but will it lead to knowledge, wisdom, and ultimately action in various districts and communities? Many folks are hopeful, but we'll have to wait to find out what kind of change this new publicly reported data spurs and how much change overall occurs. Speaking of communities in action, ESSA does require states and districts to engage parents and other family members when talking about the new law. That's not totally new, since NCLB required something similar, but I think many states, as they consider how to handle ESSA, are making an attempt to not just start a new round of outreach to parents, but also to reach out to other people in the community and various community groups and advocates in order to get more and more diverse input and comments about how the new federal law should be handled. So, for example, my colleague Daryl Burnett recently visited Colorado to check in on state education officials who were conducting a 7-city listening tour, if you will, to talk to folks about ESSA. I think many state K-12 leaders are trying to learn lessons about about what they did and did not do to explain to the general public things like the Common Core State Standards several years ago, and how that impacted not just sentiment about the standards, but things related to the standards, such as new tests. So one question states will be dealing with on this front is, how do you get more types of people to engage with states about ESSA? Will local and state teachers' unions have a large role? Is that a good or a bad thing? Or to put it another way, can you find a way to build an orchid? So here are a few other changes ESSA makes that you might be interested in. Nearly 50 federal programs, like funding for advanced placement courses, school counselors, and other things have been consolidated into a big block grant available to states. ESSA authorizes this block grant for $1.6 billion in federal cash, but the proposed Obama budget for the next fiscal year gives it significantly less. There's now a fight in Congress about this. Some lawmakers are upset about that funding level, and as we know, fights in Congress invariably turn out well. ESSA also creates a federal preschool program for around $250 million. That will be administered jointly by the U.S. Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services. And then there's funding. ESSA didn't make truly significant and sweeping changes to federal funding for education. The Title I formula remains the same, for example, after a lot of discussions about whether to change it. And since ESSA itself does not appropriate federal money, overall funding levels for various programs must still be decided by Congress, as I alluded to earlier. But there are a few notable changes from NCLB to ESSA that impact federal money. First, under ESSA, it will be much easier for schools to use Title I funds for school-wide purposes than it was under No Child Left Behind. Schools can basically now apply to states for waivers and get Title I funds and use them for school-wide purposes. In addition, districts will no longer have to itemize the cost of their services to disadvantaged students to show that federal funds are supplementing and not supplanting state and local money. Both of those changes are designed to make life easier for districts when it comes to how money is used and how it's accounted for. And that leads me to the big fight I alluded to earlier, now taking place between Congress and the Education Department. It's basically about the department's efforts to ensure that federal funds supplement and don't take the place of state and local money, something I alluded to earlier. Secretary of Education John B. King Jr. has indicated that the department is very interested in using a certain kind of per-pupil funding test between Title I schools, those are schools with relatively large shares of low-income students, and non-Title I schools, relatively wealthy schools, in order to verify that federal funds are supplemental. He's talking about this in the context of equity. But Republican members of Congress in particular, as well as teachers' unions, say the department isn't allowed to do this, and others are concerned about unintended consequences as well as the additional burden the possible rule could create for school districts in order to comply. Remember I said earlier, there's going to be more reporting about detailed per-pupil expenditures. Some have pointed out that it doesn't make sense to have that requirement but not have it inform debates about equitable school funding and on matters of compliance. And again, others say that reporting requirements aren't necessarily appropriate when it comes to compliance. If the department gets its way, it could significantly alter what level of resources districts allocate to different types of schools and how those resources are dished out. Now, keep in mind that the federal department has yet to release regulations governing accountability under ESSA or any of these things. They're in the process of doing that, and they're further along on some than others, perhaps. But until those regulations are published, we don't know exactly how states and districts will have to proceed. So we expect accountability regulations, which are much anticipated, to come out fairly soon. But then there will be a public comment period for people to provide feedback before the regulations are actually finalized. The department also gathered a bunch of state and local officials, advocates, and others for negotiating sessions to craft regulations on two topics: that requirement for federal funds supplementing and not supplanting other K-12 money, and testing. So the negotiating team agreed to language on testing, which has yet to be finalized again, but fell short on that spending test for federal funds, in large part because of the controversy I mentioned just a few moments ago. So as a result of this dispute and potentially others, some if not a lot of the good bipartisan feeling that came with ESSA's passage has evaporated. And the accountability regulations will also be a good test of how people feel about the federal role in education and educational law. It's virtually certain that the regulations, whatever's in them, will trigger a lot of debate and controversy. So as you can see, there are various ways to find out more facts about ESSA. And if you want to keep track of this stuff, there are a few ways to do it, such as following @PoliticsK12 on Twitter and our Politics K12 blog, the URL for which you can see up on your slide. So that does it for my part of the presentation, and now I will hand it back over to you, Mark.
Hi, thank you, Andrew. Thanks for a great summary for what's in the ESSA law and what lies ahead. We're really looking forward to the question and answer session, where I think we'll have a chance to dig even deeper into some of these specific subjects. We've got plenty of things queued up, plenty of questions from the audience that are coming in. Before we move on to the Q&A and your questions for Andrew, we've got a quick message here from our sponsors at Instructure.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, today. We appreciate your time. Canvas is a learning management platform that falls in line greatly with what ESSA is trying to achieve. I think allowing districts to utilize personalized learning, flexible and adaptive learning opportunities for the 21st century learner are all things that the Canvas platform delivers, both for the teacher and the student in a variety of ways. And we'll talk more about that after the Q&A period. Thank you again for your time today.
Okay, thank you very much, and welcome back to us. Once again, I'm Mark Baumster with Education Week, and I'm here with Andrew Uchafuso, who is our lead congressional correspondent, and we're talking about the rollout of the new Every Student Succeeds Act. We're going to get right into the question and answer portion of the webinar now. There's a lot of ground to cover, and we will get to as many questions as we can. Let's start off here with Andrew, with kind of a big picture question that's been touched on by a number of our audience members. What's been some of the reaction from various different constituencies in the education world, advocates and others, to the new law and all of its changes? An awful lot to take a look at there.
Sure. So the basic line is that Republicans in Congress and many state and local education leaders, they really like ESSA as it's written. Just to give you an example of how much those folks like it, when the bill was finalized, but before President Barack Obama signed it, the National Governors Association fully endorsed the bill. I believe that was the first time the Governors Association fully endorsed federal legislation in nearly 20 years. So that's one indication. And also the teachers' unions, like a lot of what's in ESSA as well, they think it will provide more flexibility for teachers in local schools and relieve them from many mandates under the Obama administration they felt were too onerous. So who's a little less enthusiastic about ESSA? Some Democrats in Congress fear that unless the federal education department, gives clear and robust regulations for the law, states and districts may not do a particularly good job looking out for the academic interests and achievement of traditionally disadvantaged students. That's something I sort of alluded to earlier. And the so-called civil rights community, civil rights advocacy groups, particularly those in Washington, but also elsewhere, they largely feel the same way. They're very concerned about how ESSA could let the reins get too slack, so to speak, from the federal government's perspective. They want strong oversight of civil rights-related issues in ESSA, and that might prove to be difficult given the political context of the law.
You touch on the political aspect of it, and just want to take a little bit of a question out of sequence here, an interesting question from our audience. You mentioned people are kind of waiting for the regulations. One member of the audience asked, what's the likelihood that we're going to see regulatory language prior to the election? And if it's published prior to the election, could it change after that? What's the political context of the regulatory environment?
So, as I indicated earlier, the next presidential administration, whoever's in charge, is probably going to have a pretty outsized role in determining the approval of state plans for this. And also, as I indicated earlier, we do expect at least initial regulations, the kind that go before the public for comment. We do expect those to come out relatively soon over the summer, so in the not too distant future. But beyond that, we don't really know. We don't have firm deadlines in terms of, for example, when states can start submitting their plans. We expect it to be later this year, potentially pretty late in the year, and also what the deadline for states will be. We don't know that yet either. So states are waiting to hear about that, but obviously they're trying to move as quickly as they can, given all the moving parts, towards getting these plans ready. But there's still a fair share of uncertainty about when regulations are going to be finalized and when states are going to be able, at least, to start submitting their ESSA plans, so to speak.
And any new administration, Democratic or Republican, would have an opportunity to put its own fingerprints on the regulatory environment. Things are not going to be completely set in stone before they come into office. Is that correct?
That's right, and that's what makes the timing of ESSA's passage particularly interesting. As I said, by the time many states probably start submitting plans in the early part of next year, Obama will be out of office, and either a President Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders or President Donald Trump will be taking office. And so they'll have a tough job in terms of, starting up a new education department with new personnel, new leaders, new priorities, but they're also going to have to be looking at these state plans and saying, well, what do we want to see out of these? What are we going to tell states that they need to do? Now, obviously, the regulatory machine might be pretty well in motion by then, but I think there will be a pretty strong opportunity for the next administration to, as you said, put its stamp on what the new law actually looks like in terms of how states handle it.
Now, in the meantime, states really are they're not just waiting around for the education department to do its thing on regulations. One questioner is curious, how are really the states working together to get the input from the various stakeholders that you've laid out as they put together their accountability plans? What kind of outreach are they doing to the folks who are ultimately going to be affected by these accountability plans and rules?
Yeah, that's a good question. Appropriately enough, since we're talking about ESSA, I think the answer is going to vary a lot, most likely from state to state. Based on reporting that I've done on this issue, I can tell you that local community advocates and local civil rights groups and local civic organizations of various stripes, they are very excited by the possibilities ESSA provides to connect them more closely with schools and districts as they develop sort of a strategy for handling ESSA. Advocates, for example, think that the ESSA language, the language that puts a greater emphasis on broader measures of school quality, it will open up more and a greater variety of discussions and provide a more influence to a broader group of individuals and groups that may have an interest in their local schools. For example, Wisconsin Superintendent Tony Evers, I know, is putting a much bigger emphasis on getting input from local civil rights groups when he considers school turnaround methods in particular. He's pleased that some of the more prescriptive turnaround methods that proliferated under the School Improvement Grant Program, he won't have to deal with those anymore, and he can build sort of a more organic school turnaround method based on input from local groups in cities like Milwaukee. So that's just one example. It's too soon to say exactly how states will go about this en masse, if there'll be any big trend. But, they haven't had to do this kind of work with a new federal education law. It's been in 15 years. It's been that long since NCLB became a reality. So it's in many respects too early to say yet, and what the general trends are.
Yeah, there's some questions from the audience, actually. Someone was asking the question of just whether states are getting ahead of themselves. How quickly should they be moving on this in the lack of specific guidance from the feds? Is it kind of necessary for them to begin this process of putting their plans together even this early in the game?
That's a good question. I mean, far be it for me to tell, states what they should and should not be doing under this process. But, I think, as I indicated earlier in the presentation, there's a variety of, states are at varying levels of sort of how much work they need to do to just come in compliance with ESSA. For example, the states that don't right now measure English language proficiency in their state school ratings. It may sound like a simple, direct thing to do, but that's tricky. That requires obviously collecting more data and then disaggregating it. So, I think some states are at varying level of readiness. Some states have, worked closely with their communities on issues ranging from Common Core to teacher evaluations, and in other states that's not so much the case. And maybe the way that states have handled outreach during sort of, the sometimes politically difficult era of Race to the Top and Common Core and waivers, there's a lot going on. And maybe states that did a lot of outreach during those policies, they might be better prepared to sort of move more quickly, and they've already got the networks established to gather input and then proceed from there. But again, you're going to be hearing this a lot about ESSA. It might be difficult in many circumstances to easily and quickly pick up on general trends for how states are handling this.
Now you mentioned teacher performance, and this is certainly an area that the states have dived into pretty deeply, and with variety of different pushback and success. On this topic of teachers, are state test results still going to be, to what degree will they still be tied to teacher performance evaluations?
So, ESSA, as I said earlier, there are no teacher evaluation requirements in ESSA saying you have to do this or you have to have X, Y, and Z in teacher evaluations. However, I would be hesitant, in fact, to make a leap between that language and then stating, well, that means a whole bunch of states are going to start eliminating test scores and teacher evaluations entirely. There's clearly an appetite for this across states over the last several years. For example, I was talking to someone from Georgia today about their evaluation system, and he mentioned that, this year, the state reduced the weight of test scores and evaluations from 50% to 30%. That was done through state legislation, but it was something that the state superintendent and the state education department in Georgia, they backed that change. So, and I know that several other states have considered doing something similar. So I would be worried about claiming that this is going to disappear from the landscape across states. Now, it might happen in a few states. If my understanding is correct, New York, for example, has put a moratorium on using test scores and teacher evaluations for the next several years. But New York has unique educational politics and politics around evaluations. So, there won't be any federal mandates or pressure or incentives to do this anymore, at least as far as ESSA is concerned. But that doesn't mean that this is going to go away necessarily. I think lots of folks in state legislatures do want these test scores included in some fashion. Maybe in many places it will just carry less weight than it has before.
Now you mentioned Common Core a little bit earlier. Now the situation is very different when it comes to standards in Common Core in ESSA, correct? I mean, that's a situation where the law really does bring in a kind of a different environment.
Yes. The incentives to adopt Common Core that we got used to hearing about from the federal government under the education department under Obama, things like Race to the Top, those competitive grants, as well as waivers from No Child Left Behind. The federal government can no longer dangle those kinds of carrots and sticks with respect to standards. So, I guess maybe this is an ancillary point, or a bit of a tangent, but, you could argue that both the pro-Common Core and anti-Common Core folks could be pleased by that sort of change in law under ESSA. And you might be wondering, well, why are the pro-Common Core folks happy? Well, they've seen in the last few years that despite all the political struggle and hot potato politics of Common Core in many states, most states have stuck by the standards. Now, that's not to say that all states have done a great job implementing the standards. That answer varies. But most states have stuck with keeping the standards on the books. And now the pro-Common Core people can point to ESSA and say, well, there's no federal pressure to do this anymore. We don't have to worry about that political aspect of it. So now it really is up to states, and if states continue to largely stick by the Common Core, the pro-Common Core people will be able to say, well, they like it after all, regardless of any sort of federal encouragement or pressure. Do we know that's going to happen? No, we don't. And again, this is not a commentary on how well states are implementing the Common Core. But yes, to return to sort of the general point of the question, the federal government has a greatly reduced role and sort of a new restriction on its role in states' adoption of standards, and states ultimately adopt their own standards officially. So.
This whole accountability business can get fairly technical at times, but there's a lot of interest in reporting the data, how the data gets reported out. We've got an interesting question from somebody here about saying under in the current accountability environment, a lot of states are stepping away from these letter grade systems as a way to identify schools, and they're moving more toward dashboard systems, so-called dashboard systems of reporting levels of school performance and student performance. Is this something that the feds are likely to favor and allow for under the regs? Is it an allowable model to use a dashboard style system?
The dashboard accountability systems will be allowed under the law, although there's a potentially tricky aspect to it. But just so folks understand what dashboards are, several states have expressed at least an interest in using the system, and several large districts have also begun using dashboards. Dashboard systems, they aim to provide parents and others with more information about a variety of measures of school performance without utilizing the classic one-size-fits-all rating that schools get under systems like A to F accountability metrics. Those who like dashboards say that it creates less of a focus on test scores, it reduces unhealthy competition between schools, and dashboards encourage principals to address a wider variety of issues in their schools. Recently California agreed to begin using an accountability system starting in the fall of 2017, I believe, that lists student growth, school climate, and other measures in a dashboard system. So the big sort of knotty question with dashboard system is, what do you do once you collect all that data, organize it, and disseminate it to the public? And with respect to ESSA, how do you use a dashboard system to identify the lowest performing 5% of schools, for example? That's something that dashboard systems aren't necessarily designed to accommodate in terms of defining the lowest performing schools, by what metric. And yet ESSA requires it. So we could be seeing some tricky battles about that coming up. And also folks are asking questions, like how would you create a single composite rating for a school using, for example, school suspension data? Is it even a good idea to try? How do you rate a school based on that? And maybe some parents, although A to F grades might be misleading in some cases, might they be confused by the lack of a final summative rating for each school, which dashboards typically don't provide? Those who prioritize comparing school performance, they say it's difficult to pull off with a dashboard. And then there's, as you might expect, there's a lot of data collection that goes into creating dashboards, which is not necessarily easier. So that's a very long-winded answer to a very short question, but it is something that districts are and states are interested in, but we don't yet know exactly how it's going to play out in terms of popularity.
And there's still going to be, states are still going to be collecting a tremendous, as you pointed out, a tremendous amount of data. They're going to have to disaggregate or break apart that data for different types of students, different kinds of student groups. They're going to have to cross-tabulate the data, whatever cross-tabulate may mean. I think it has some importance in that area. Do states still have to set a long-term goal that identifies a percentage of students' proficiency? That was something that people really hated about NCLB by a certain date, or do they have to articulate that all students are college and career ready? What does it say about student rating and student performance rather than just school performance?
So on this score, there isn't really a have-to per se in terms of thinking about, adequate yearly progress style goals. As I said towards the beginning of the presentation, states can set their own academic goals for students. So for example, if they want to prioritize getting all students college and career ready by a certain date, or getting a certain share of students college and career ready by a certain date, our understanding is that they can do that. If they want to get a certain share of students proficient by a certain state, they can do that. Now, that latter approach, will it be popular? Well, given the history of NCLB, especially the recent history, probably not. But, as I also indicated earlier, and it's important to stress again, the goals that states set, whatever they are, and they have a lot of flexibility with what they are, they have to address or point to achievement gaps between subgroups of students. They have to use test scores. They have to use English language acquisition. They have to use graduation rates. You might have different sets of goals, not just one, but it's important that those are factors, and I think those will be crucial in what kind of academic goals many states ultimately use.
When you mentioned English language acquisition, and we've had a number of questions that have come in having to do with English language learners, ELL students. What does this law do that's new and interesting in the area of English learners under ESSA in terms of both data collection and state requirements?
Yeah, that's a really important question. English language learners and English language acquisition, it's going to be a much bigger issue under ESSA than it has been previously under federal law. We just came out with a great report from Education Week about English language learners, and sort of appropriate given the ESSA environment. So I mentioned earlier that states will have to include English language acquisition in their state accountability ratings under ESSA, but there are several other things that you should know. Whatever tests states and districts choose to give, they have to be accessible to English language learners as well as students in special education. That means, for example, if students need extra time to take and complete the test, they should get it. In addition, tests to measure English language proficiency for English language learners, the states pick or create, they must measure reading and writing, but also speaking and listening skills. ESSA also requires states to establish consistent standards for determining when students require English learner services and for determining if students are ready to exit special programs. That's progress, according to some ELL advocates who have said that right now states have inconsistent entry and exit criteria for ELL services. So states need to make every effort to provide students with tests in languages a significant number of students speak under ESSA. Right now, very few states offer those tests. So in deciding what languages to offer tests in, states should consider under ESSA which languages are spoken by a significant number of kids in one or more districts. That's according to ESSA regulations that are in the works, but not quite yet finalized or released to the public. And importantly, states have to include the second most common language spoken by students in the state other than English when it comes to these tests. Finally, I mentioned earlier that states can give advanced math tests to students who are in correspondingly advanced math courses above their current grade level. However, under ESSA, in order to take advantage of this option, states have to provide the appropriate accommodations for English language learners. So that sort of gives you an idea of the extent to which English language acquisition, English language learners are newly emphasized in ESSA compared to previous federal law.
In the regulatory discussions about this area of the law, how have the districts and the states reacted to some of these requirements? It sounds like it would be very useful for the students. Also sounds like it could be a large, pretty good lift for states that may be not too far down the road in putting these materials together.
Are you talking about specifically for English language learners, Mark?
Well, specifically for English language learners, yes.
Yeah, I think it is going to be a big lift for states. As I mentioned earlier, only 6 states right now count English language proficiency in their sort of traditional state accountability ratings that people often think of when they think of state accountability. So just to meet that requirement is going to require a lot of work. So yeah, the short answer is that states have a lot of work to do in this area, particularly those states where the English language learner population is growing, and English language learners in general are a rising, it's a growing population of public school students across the country in general. So states are going to have a lot of work to do in this area.
And what are you touched a little bit earlier in your presentation about some of the funding implications in the new law, including on the use of federal funding and Title I. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. So, again, the ESSA is not a federal budget bill. It's not an appropriations bill. So, it's not going to, by itself, change the overall level of funding for public schools, and Title I is the single biggest federal grant, and it's obviously earmarked for low-income students. There are 4 formulas that go into determining the distribution of Title I money. Those were not changed, although it looked like at one point maybe they would be. And, again, I just want to stress that although it didn't seem like it would be a big issue when ESSA was passed necessarily, there is a big debate now because of what the Education Department has indicated it wants to do. There is a big debate now about the extent to which school districts should prove that state and local funds to rich and poor schools are essentially or relatively close to being equal. There's a different part of the federal law that deals with the equalization of school services between different types of schools, but this has become a big debate in what's known in wonky Washington language as a supplement, not supplant. Again, the federal government wants to ensure that federal resources are not simply taking the place of state and local funding gaps, but others say that the Education Department, in terms of what it's proposed, is going too far, and that the regulation would not only be burdensome to many districts who they say might have to transfer a lot of teachers, violate collective bargaining agreements at the local level, but they also say it could actually hurt many poor students in a few ways. So the Education Department doesn't agree with that interpretation. We don't yet know how that's going to shake out, but it's something that has become quite a big fight in Washington. I don't know how many folks saw it coming, and as I said, it can get very wonky at times, but it is something that if the Education Department gets its way, ultimately could have a very big impact on how districts spend money on schools.
Interesting. We've got we've got a couple of questions on topics that we don't necessarily touch on too often. One question has to do with whether ESSA has the same research-based language that NCLB had. Sounds a bit technical, but it's something that got a lot of attention in the research place in the NCLB era. What do we know about that?
Yeah, so there is a change in terms of how research is handled in the language. In terms of the change from NCLB to ESSA. So NCLB cited, quote, scientifically based research over 100 times in the law. Instead of that, ESSA uses the phrase evidence-based to describe the requirement for, programs and interventions. And there are tiered levels of evidence in ESSA. There's strong evidence, which has to include a randomized controlled trial. There's moderate evidence, which has to include something like at least a regression discontinuity analysis, And there's also promising evidence, which has to include at least one well-designed and implemented correlational study that controls for selection bias. So that gives you an idea of sort of how there are different tiers, and states can decide exactly how they want to utilize those various levels. If they want to, they can utilize programs and research based on just the lowest sort of promising evidence tier. So the basic takeaway that researchers and other folks should have is that, ESSA seems to indicate that Congress has, it's given up sort of demanding a gold standard for research, at least as far as, how it goes in the law.
A couple of other real quick questions. Thanks for that. A couple of other real quick questions. How are school librarians and libraries affected? Something that doesn't always get a lot of attention, but quite important at the schoolhouse level.
Yeah, so one important change that we've noticed is that, there's a definition for specialized instructional support personnel. ESSA updates that definition to specifically include school librarians. And from what we've seen, the indication is that people who work in school libraries, like librarians, have taken heart from that because it provides them with sort of an additional recognition in terms of their roles in schools, and that's now enshrined in federal law. In their ESSA-related plans for Title I accountability, districts are now allowed to include how they will utilize school libraries to do things like increase students' digital literacy, as well as their academic achievement. And in Title IV Part A, which is the big block grant I mentioned earlier, there is a grant at least authorized for districts to address technological needs. That includes things like internet connectivity and access to school libraries. So, there are some changes there for school libraries under ESSA.
Time for, I think, just one real brief question in kind of the last minutes we have here on the Q&A section. Big picture question. What happens if ESSA, under ESSA, or to ESSA, if the next president should decide to do something radical like close the Department of Education?
Okay, I think I know where this question is coming from. It's probably rooted in thoughts about a President Donald Trump, or more generically, pledged by many GOP presidential candidates made this year to either drastically cut back or eliminate the U.S. Department of Education. So I am not an attorney. This is not official legal advice or analysis in any capacity. But so, I mean, it's a good question. One reaction I would have is that even if a federal agency like the Education Department is eliminated, I don't think necessarily that overturns an act of Congress, which ESSA literally is. So, in theory, it's possible that if the Education Department is eliminated, then oversight of education and education-related laws could largely shift to another federal agency like Health and Human Services or the Labor Department, or, maybe responsibility for programs that had been under the Ed Department, they could be broken up and shifted to several different federal agencies. So it's important to remember that the Education Department itself has been around for, I think a little bit less than 40 years. Before that, there was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which oversaw education in the U.S. from the federal perspective. And the original federal education law, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, you might remember, was passed before the creation of a separate cabinet-level federal education department. So
it's to some degree, it's very much the law itself is here to stay. The policies may follow on. So thank you for
an act of Congress.
An act of Congress. Well, thank you, Andrew. Thanks for all of those insightful questions. And now we've got a really quick message from our sponsor, Instructure.
Thank you. Again, this is Casey Rasmussen. I'm with Instructure. Our product is Canvas Learning Management System. If you notice on the slide here, it talks about since our inception in 2011, Canvas has really become the platform that reaches both K-12 up to higher ed colleges and universities. We have over 2,000 clients in 40 different countries, 10 million active users. And what I think is interesting about the Canvas platform and how it relates to ESSA and the conversation today is that not only is it a tool for use all the way down to the classroom level that gets kids prepared for college and career, but it also is a tool that allows the teacher to control the experience and allow students to respond to the content in a way that suits them best, whether that be a one-to-one device, whether it be on their own personal device, classroom engagement, at-home engagement. So it's a platform that's, one, extremely flexible, but two, reaches those students all the way from kindergarten to college and university and into their career. It also is a platform that allows them to build that data. We talked about dashboards a little bit today, and what I think is more important than the dashboard view and aggregating that data all up to a single view, it's also really important for the teacher to have access to that data. Allow them to guide their students and provide real-time feedback and adjust and adapt on the fly for their students. So having that data at their fingertips, both from a teacher and a student perspective, as well as parents, allows them to make better decisions earlier in the process rather than waiting until the end of the school year or to those critical times where you're trying to pull together data and report. If you can go to the next slide for me, I'll talk about just a couple of other things here. Thank you very much. This also talks about how Canvas impacts new decision-making power, putting the power in the states and the district's hands as opposed to at the federal level. You can provide coursework both online and in real time, as well as blended and flipped environments. Canvas is a platform that allows you to experiment with the new kinds of testing. And then in addition to that, it's also a platform where you can deliver that consistent PD for teachers to ensure that high quality of teaching for all students at every level. And then the last slide, and I think we'll wrap up. The last slide here talks about how Canvas has impacted thousands of districts across the world, improving teaching and learning. That's really our core goal as a company, allowing you to be very flexible in how you're teaching your students, but also being actionable, allowing districts to report both at the state and federal level, but also make better real-time decisions to impact their students' learning. Thank you again for joining us today and allowing us to participate.
Thank you so much. We'd like to also remind everyone, if you'd like to watch today's presentation again, an on-demand archive will be available online through edweek.org within the next 24 hours. You can also visit edweek.org to find articles that explore today's topic, along with online resources about ESSA and an Education Week explainer video. Once again, thanks to our guest expert, Andrew Ujafusa, and everyone who attended today's webinar.